Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. Some of you may know or may have guessed based on my posts across social media that I live in Southern California. In fact, I was born and bred in SoCal, which means I've spent the entirety of my 30-ish years of life right here in Southern California. And that means that I'm pretty well acquainted with any of the struggles that go along with living in a place that outsiders consider a paradise. And there are a plethora of struggles, such as our very high cost of living, the dearth of affordable housing, and our very terrible traffic. But none of these topics made the cut for this video, so what I actually want to talk to you about stems from the reality of what it's like to live in a state that is constantly on fire. And that means we have a lot to talk about today. I have my notes right here. So why don't you go ahead and grab your snowflake drink of choice and let's get into this. California is well known for things like our beautiful beaches where it's allegedly always sunny and 75 degrees Fahrenheit or about 23 degrees Celsius for my metric friends out there who use the far superior system of measurement. If only those of us in the US can catch up. The glitz and glam of Hollywood, which, fun fact that you guys didn't ask for, I've never actually seen the Hollywood sign in person. So if you've seen it and don't live here, you've got one California thing up on me. The majesty of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where we'll find places like Yosemite National Park and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, safely nestled in the valleys and hillsides of those beautiful mountains. The parched earth in Death Valley, especially at Badwater Basin, which is 282 feet or 855 meters below sea level. This is also the place where some of the hottest temperatures on the face of the earth are recorded, and you will constantly see them reporting very high temperatures throughout the year if you follow their social media. It is fascinating. But we also have some higher elevation deserts that are painted with color nearly every single year when the wildflowers bloom, and if you get the chance to go out and see them, they are absolutely breathtaking. And then, of course, no one can forget our awe-inspiring groves of giant sequoias. And since we've looked at all of these places, there might not be much in common, but there is certainly one thing they do have in common, and that is wildfire. And to begin our wildfire discussion here, I think that we need to take a look at some of the CAL FIRE statistics that were current as of August 28th, 2024. So if you take a look at these numbers, they may be something different than what I'm reporting here. So keep in mind, these numbers are updated on a weekly basis. Looking at the 2024 year-to-date numbers, we have seen 5,588 wildland fires, so wildfires, and 833,611 acres burned. That does sound like a lot, doesn't it? But how does that compare to, say, 2023 year-to-date numbers? Well, in 2023, we saw 4,676 wildland fires with 221,078 acres burned. So that is quite a difference from one year to next. But those are just 2 years. Let's look at the 5-year average. And that 5-year average is 5,468 wildland fires with 679,648 acres burned. What do these numbers exactly show us at a glance when we're looking at them? Because right now, those are just some big numbers that I've reported to you guys that show that we've got a lot of wildfires here that burn a lot of acres. Well, at a glance, they're showing us that our 2024 fire season has already eclipsed not only last year, but the 5-year average. And that is kind of a big deal. because if you were to look through the incident notes on the CAL FIRE website or an app like Watch Duty, which I use Watch Duty personally a lot to get alerts about wildfires in my area, you'd see that a decent chunk of these fires not only burned for multiple weeks, but they also took days to upwards of a week to contain at a significant level of containment. I'm not talking about like 5% containment. I'm talking about getting above that 50% hurdle. And this is less ideal than what it could be, because in general, the longer it takes to contain a wildfire, the likelihood of it becoming catastrophic will significantly increase. And that is a big deal. And at this point, you might be thinking about the numbers that I just shared with you and wondering why they're not plastered all over the media, because those are big numbers. You would think that we would see that kind of everywhere. But as I said before, California is a state where there's always a fire burning somewhere, regardless of if we're in what is considered fire season or not. And in case you don't know what fire season is, since I realize if you don't live in a place with wildfire, you may have never heard that term before. Fire season is, in general, the part of the year where that risk of wildfire is elevated. So in Northern California, it's usually going to begin in June or July and then runs until like October or November-ish. And then down here in Southern California, it usually begins in May or June and then will end in October. But again, just because we have this fire season doesn't mean that wildfires cannot occur throughout the entire year. And in fact, some of our most catastrophic wildfires have occurred outside of that fire season. Fire season is just the time of the year where they consider it a little more dangerous if fires do pop up, and the likelihood of them getting out of control is a little bit higher. And so because California is basically constantly on fire, most of the fires that we see here are not going to make it outside of local news in their areas. Even when I'm scrolling Watch Duty or browsing the CAL FIRE website, I've never heard of most of the fires that I see burning there. And it's because they're not close to me. I'm in Riverside County, and I'll get alerts for fires down in like San Diego County, and they're not really a threat to me for anything other than air quality. So this is one of the reasons why you're not really going to see them outside of their very local news, like the very local news areas. But that is not always true. Sometimes our fires do make national news. So let's take a look back at 2018. And we're picking 2018 because that's the deadliest and most destructive fire season in California in recorded history. There were 7,948 wildfires, 1,975,086 acres burned, and 100 confirmed losses of life. Let that sink in a little bit. Because even though there might be years where there might be more wildfires or more acres burned, that loss of life is one of the very sobering statistics that make this fire season that we're talking about from 2018 so significant. On August 4th, 2018, a national disaster was declared in Northern California. Large fires continued to pop up and burn until the end of the year after that national disaster was declared. The Camp Fire, which started in November, became California's deadliest and most destructive fire on record, occurred in 2018. I guarantee you probably at least heard whispers of the Camp Fire in the media, because that was a big deal, and there's still, in some areas, cleanup from that fire occurring in California, because the scars that these fires leave is a reality to Californians. It is just something that we've had to learn how to live and be prepared for. Soon after the national disaster was declared, Donald Trump, who was president at the time, tweeted this lovely gem that we need to look at. California wildfires are being magnified and made so much worse by the bad environmental laws which aren't allowing massive amount of readily available water to be properly utilized. It is being diverted to the Pacific Ocean. Must also tree clear to stop fire spreading. This was only one tweet in a series of tweets and statements that he gave about the wildfires in California. And let me just tell you, they just reek of being ill-informed, privileged, and just uncaring. In those tweets, there were threats to withdraw federal support from the national disaster and wildfire efforts. And during this whole period is where the infamous clean up the floors statement when it comes to wildfire preparedness and forestry comes from, as far as the lovely gems of knowledge from Donald Trump. It's also worth it to note that Glenn McDonald, a scientist from UCLA, did respond to the tweet, saying that even if more water was diverted from the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers to fight the fires, it wouldn't really make much of a difference because the lack of water here isn't the problem when it comes to our wildfire problem. And if water isn't the problem when it comes to this wildfire management in California, then what is? Is it a case of poor forestry management and environmental laws as Trump claimed? Not exactly. While it is true that historical forest management practices did set us up for these intense fires we're seeing in recent history, California has been adapting to how wildfires are dealt with to create an ever-evolving and comprehensive plan to deal with wildfires across the state. Historically, fire was seen as something with little to no benefit that had to be suppressed as fast as possible. And around the 1930s, researchers in the southern United States began to push back against this accepted view of fire management. Beginning around 1910 is where we see the field of wildfire ecology begin. And it was found that ecosystems that evolved with fire, like a lot of the ecosystems we have here in California, typically not only survive this periodic fire occurrences, but they actually need them to flourish. Today, wildfire management policies are drafted and refined with the research that we see in the field of wildfire ecology in mind. And it is taken as a full look at the entire ecosystem, the pros and cons of the fires, and the management is then carried out after everything is considered. Now, of course, in emergency situations, decisions need to be made on the fly, but in general, the management plans are looking at the accepted science. And that is a good thing. So, what did decades of suppression do to these ecosystems that are adapted to fire? Well, it created a situation where there was a lot of fuel that would have normally been burned off over the course of many fire cycles. And in addition to this buildup of brush, some native plants actually produce chemicals that promote fire because their seeds need exposure to fire in order to germinate. Now, put a little pin in that there because that is a little more nuanced than what I'm letting on here, but it's absolutely fascinating. Those same plants that produce those chemicals will sometimes even be seen to produce two crops of seeds, some that can germinate without fire and some that need the fire to germinate. But that's a topic for a whole nother video. That's just something that I find fascinating. I love wildfire ecology. It is super cool. And then basically, if we're taking all of this brush and the combination with the plants that actually need to promote the fire in mind, you create a ticking time bomb where it was no longer an if a fire pops up and gets out of control, but a when a fire pops up and gets out of control. So you can look back through the CAL FIRE record to see reports from devastating fires that have occurred throughout the years if you're curious. But as always, managing what we have here is not as simple as just clearing the brush off the forest floor to prevent wildfires, which I can see how a lot of people would assume it would be that simple. Just, oh, clear the forest floor, there's no fuel for the fire, wildfire problem gone. No, because our ecosystems need the fire as well, so not that simple. And it's not just the brush that contributes to the wildfires in California. There are other things such as drought. California is constantly in and out of drought, and it causes the plants in the surrounding area to be very dry, which makes it more ideal for these fires to take off and potentially burn out of control. Wind is also a huge factor. Strong wind provides the fires with plenty of oxygen, and when it is windy, it's not safe for firefighters to get close enough to these fires to contain them. And then in Southern California, we see Santa Ana winds, which are hot, dry winds that can reach very high speeds and can help fires become even more destructive even faster because they are so hot and dry and fast. And then when a fire gets big enough, it kind of generates its own wind almost, and it has its own kind of propulsion system there. I know it's a little more in depth than that, but growing up in a place with a lot of wildfire, that is kind of how it's explained to us when we're kids. That the wind gets worse the closer you get to a big fire because it's helping generate that wind itself. We also see invasive species have a very big impact on fires here. Species like the gold-spotted oak borer are contributing to die-off of our native vegetation, like our native oak trees, and that creates even more fuel for the fire because then we have these very large dead trees all over the place, and that becomes a problem not just with wildfire suppression, but also with our forestry management practices as a whole. And I could go on for a while about invasive species in Southern California. So I'm going to move on from that topic because we don't have time for that tangent. And then human activity is a very big deal when it comes to talking about wildfires because 90% of fires are started by human activity. It comes from things like downed power lines, unattended campfires, discarded cigarette butts, vehicle and equipment use, and many, many other human activities that you might not even be aware of can actually start fires that can very quickly burn out of control if they have enough fuel. But one other thing that we need to talk about and what contributes to these very intense, very large wildfires we see in recent time is climate change. And as our climate is shifting to be hotter and drier, fires are also becoming hotter and more intense. And as these fires become more intense, ecosystems are just not keeping up. And it's getting past the limits that these protective adaptations that the vegetation has come to evolve in these fire-filled ecosystems they can't keep up with the intensity of the fires we're seeing now. They cannot adapt fast enough. And so this means we're seeing even more die-off and even more potential fuel. And there's shorter intervals now between these very large fires. And while native ecosystems in the past would have been able to bounce back, they're not able to fully bounce back now when we have these very large fires with very few years in between them. And again, that just puts a lot more stress on the ecosystem, creates more fuel and more opportunity for these big fires to get out of control. And then we also see things like non-native grasses outcompeting native forest vegetation. So what should be a lovely forest is now grassland. And these grasses are easier to burn because they do dry out every single year. and they grow back quickly the following season. You'll also see that grassland thing popping up in other states where a fire will go through and normally a pine forest would grow back, but instead you're seeing grass. And again, they're not native. They're basically an invasive species that is outcompeting the native species there. And then it just makes that fire cycle even more intense. And these are the things that are contributing to these very large wildfires. So as the officials are creating their plans for wildfire management and forestry, they have to take all of these things into account. So it's not as simple as just draining our rivers and cleaning our forest floors. We have to deal with the human activity, the natural fire cycle, wind, drought, climate change, all of the things when we're trying to deal with wildfires here in the state. But I know you might be feeling a little hopeless right now at this point and thinking, what are some things that you can do to help either prevent or prepare for wildfires so you're ready? Well, the first thing, have an emergency plan. Know where you'll go if you need to evacuate. Of course, there's always going to be evacuation centers you can go to if your choice place is not available. Have your important papers, birth certificates, deeds, things like that in an easy to grab place where you can just grab them and toss them into your go bag and get the hell out. And have the essentials for every member of the family, human or animal, very easy to grab and load up and go. Because when you're evacuating, you may only have minutes to get the hell out. And then if you're trying to prevent fires, don't leave campfires unattended, and always make sure they are fully put out if you are camping. That means you're not seeing any more smoke, there are no more embers. Do not let it burn itself out when you go to bed. Put it out. Practice safe methods to dispose of cigarette butts. Don't just flick that butt out the car window. You may think it's not very likely to start a fire, but it could, and you don't want to be the reason the next massive wildfire happens. Be aware of where you're parking. Don't park in places with tall, dry vegetation, because the components on the underside of your vehicle can get very hot and can start a fire. If there's tall, dry vegetation where you want to park, find another spot. Don't start a fire with your vehicle. And if you are a homeowner or even a renter, keep your property clear of any excess dry brush, because that's going to be the best thing that you can do to protect your home and potentially your neighbors as well. Because if you are in an area where you need to be evacuated and firefighters show up and your property is full of this dry, dead brush, your property is going to be deemed unsavable if that fire comes that direction. Clearing and having defensible zones is a very important thing, not just here in California, but anywhere where the threat of wildfire is real and prevalent. So let's wrap up with some of my final thoughts here before this video gets too terribly long. Wildfire is so much a part of California that our native ecosystems have evolved specifically to thrive in a land with periodic fires. As urban development increases, it's important that we manage wildfires in a way that will decrease fatalities while keeping in mind that natural cycle of our ecosystems. Unfortunately, due to challenges like climate change and invasive species, wildfire management needs to be an ever-evolving field to keep up with new discoveries made in the field of wildfire ecology. The obvious idea of diverting more water from rivers to be used to fight fires is not enough, and dynamic solutions are needed so that people and ecosystems can continue to exist in our natural fire cycles in California, because we're not going to be able to 100% stop wildfire, and in fact we shouldn't even want that. Wildfire is an important part of our natural ecosystem, And I don't see people stopping from moving to California anytime soon, especially if the sheer number of new housing developments and condos and other apartments I see going up all over the place are an indication. We need to figure out how to live respectfully in ecosystems where wildfire is not only a part of life, but a necessity for life in that ecosystem. That's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, my sources are linked down below, and I highly encourage you to check them out and form your own opinions. You should always be wary of just taking someone's word, especially here on the internet. I mean, after all, who am I but a woman with some research and opinions? Have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one.